I'm not entirely human. I'm something else. And the longer I stay here, the more I feel myself slipping away from what I used to be." The words were like a punch to the gut, and Amelia felt her heart twist in sympathy. She had known that Jack wasn't entirely like everyone else, but to hear it laid out so plainly was almost too much to bear. He wasn't just different, he was something else entirely. A creation, a product of forces beyond his control. And yet, here he was, standing before her, fighting for his humanity. "I don't care what you were made to be," Amelia said softly, but with unwavering resolve. "I care about who you are now, and I'm not going to let anyone take that from you. Not them, not anyone." Jack's gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that made her believe. It was hope, yes, but it was also something more, something fragile, and yet powerful. It was the beginning of his own belief in himself. "You'll help me?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he couldn't quite believe the words she had just spoken. Amelia nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I'll help you. We'll do this together. I'm not going anywhere." The weight of Jack's words hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere around them had shifted, adjusting to the truth that had just been spoken. Amelia felt the ground beneath her feet seem a little less stable, as if the world itself was reconfiguring in response to the revelation. Her heart beat in her chest, faster than it should have, but it wasn't fear that gripped her. It was something deeper, a pull toward the unknown that only grew stronger as she stood there with Jack, still processing everything he had shared. The city around them was eerily quiet, the evening sky now a dark blue canvas streaked with the last remnants of twilight. The streetlights flickered on, casting soft pools of yellow light over the cobblestones. For a moment, the world outside the two of them seemed to fade away, leaving only the silence between them, the unsaid words hanging in the air. Jack shifted his weight, his shoulders tense, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I never wanted you to find out like this," he said, his voice thick with regret. "But I couldn't keep hiding it from you. I couldn't lie to you anymore." Amelia didn't say anything at first, her mind still racing to catch up with the weight of his confession. She stepped closer to him, feeling the pull of his presence. But she didn't reach for him. Not yet. She had to let him say it, to let him share this burden, no matter how heavy it was. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want you to carry this alone. You're not alone anymore, Jack." He looked at her then, his eyes dark and searching, as if trying to gauge whether he could believe her. And in that moment, Amelia knew. She had to help him believe. She had to help him find his way back to the person he truly was, not the one that others had tried to shape him into. "But what if I'm too far gone?" Jack asked, his voice a little rougher now. "What if this is who I'm meant to be, no matter how much I fight it? I was made to be something else. I don't even know if I can change anymore." Amelia shook her head, her heart swelling with compassion. "You're not broken, Jack. You don't have to be what they made you. You're more than that. You're more than the secret you've been carrying. You can change. You can be the person you've always wanted to be." He swallowed hard, and for the first time, she saw something crack in him, something fragile, something that had been buried deep inside for far too long. His shoulders slumped slightly, and the tense lines of his face softened, just a little. But his eyes remained distant, as if part of him was still locked away, still unsure if he could take that final step toward the truth. "Do you really think so?" he asked, his voice almost hesitant, as if testing her belief in him. "Do you really believe that I can change? Or am I just a lost cause?" Amelia took a deep breath, her words steady and certain. "I don't believe in lost causes, Jack. I believe in people. I believe in second chances. And I believe in you." The words hung in the air between them, a promise, a vow. Jack's eyes softened just slightly, and she saw something in his gaze that made her heart race, a glimmer of hope. It was faint, but it was there. "You really mean that?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the question itself was a fragile thing that might break if spoken too loudly. Amelia nodded, her eyes locked on his, unwavering. "I do." He stood there looking at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Amelia held her breath, unsure of what would come next. But she wasn't afraid. She was ready for whatever came. They could face it together as long as they took the first step. Finally, Jack's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It was small, but it was enough to make Amelia's heart skip a beat. Maybe we can do this. Together. The first step was the hardest, but it was also the most important. The next day, Jack and Amelia began the long process of unraveling the truth, not just about Jack's past, but about their future together. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt, moments when Jack faltered, unsure if he could truly let go of the past. But each time he hesitated, Amelia was there to remind him that he wasn't alone, that they were in this together. As they walked through the city's winding streets, they found themselves talking more openly, not just about the things that Jack had hidden, but about everything, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Jack began to open up in ways that Amelia had never imagined. The man who had once been so guarded, so distant, was slowly revealing pieces of himself, pieces that were raw, vulnerable, and real. Amelia listened. Truly listened to everything Jack had to say. She didn't judge him. She didn't try to fix him. She simply let him speak, knowing that every word he shared was another step toward his healing, another step toward reclaiming the life he had once thought was impossible. They spent hours walking through the streets, lost in conversation, lost in each other's presence. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city, they found themselves at the old stone fountain in the center of the square where they had first met. The place felt different now, as if the very air around them had changed, as if the city itself had shifted, opening up new possibilities for both of them. Jack turned to Amelia, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've given me a chance I never thought I'd have." Amelia smiled, her heart swelling with affection. "You gave yourself that chance, Jack. I just helped you see it." They stood there for a long time, watching the city come to life around them, the streets buzzing with people and sounds, the air filled with possibilities. For the first time, Jack felt like he was truly a part of it all. He wasn't just a shadow in the fog. He wasn't just a secret. He was a person, standing in the light, ready to face whatever came next. The future was still uncertain, but Jack knew one thing for sure. Whatever it held, he wouldn't face it alone. Not anymore. The evening sky had deepened to a bruised purple, the stars barely visible behind the thick clouds that had rolled in. The city felt different now, its streets colder and quieter, as if the fog had returned to swallow it whole. Amelia and Jack stood at the entrance of a forgotten alley, their footsteps the only sound in the otherwise silent city. The alley itself was narrow, lined with aging brick buildings that leaned inwards as though they were trying to keep the outside world at bay. The air here was thick with the scent of damp stone and forgotten things, a far cry from the warmth of the square where they had shared their vows to face the future together. But tonight was different. They had decided to return to the place where Jack had first hidden his truth, the place where his past had lingered like a shadow. Amelia could feel the weight of it now, the quiet terror in Jack's eyes as he stood at the edge of the alley, his back straight but his body tense, as if he were afraid of what lay ahead. The burden of his past was more than just a weight. It was a presence that hovered over him, a shadow he could never seem to shake. She knew that tonight he was going to face it, but was he ready? Was she? "Are you sure about this?" Amelia asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Her hand found his, squeezing gently. She could feel the tremor in his fingers, the uncertainty that still lingered in him, despite all that they had shared in the last few days. Despite the hope they had found in each other, Jack's past was still there, like a door that had been locked shut for far too long. Jack turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes searching hers, his face unreadable. "I have to. I don't want to hide anymore," he said, his voice steady but tight with emotion. "This is the last step. After tonight, there will be no more secrets between us." Amelia nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked down the alley. The air seemed colder here, the mist creeping in from the city, thick and oppressive. It was as if the alley itself was waiting for something, for the moment when they would confront the ghosts of Jack's past. But no matter how hard she tried to steel herself, she couldn't ignore the growing tension in the pit of her stomach. "Let's go then," she whispered, her words carrying more resolve than she felt. Together, they stepped forward, their shadows stretching long behind them, swallowed by the night. The deeper they went into the alley, the more the world around them seemed to change. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows against the walls, and the distant sounds of the city faded into an eerie silence. It felt like they were walking into another world, one that Jack had built for himself to keep the past at bay. Amelia's mind raced, trying to anticipate what Jack was about to reveal. What was it that had driven him to this point? What was it that he feared? And would it be enough to break them apart, or would it bind them together in a way they had never imagined? The alleyway stretched before them, darker now, the walls narrowing as they walked deeper into its heart. Amelia's breath came in shallow bursts, her pulse quickening with every step they took. She could feel Jack's presence beside her, his hand still holding hers, but there was an unmistakable distance between them. Not physical, but emotional. It was as if he had already retreated into the part of him that had never fully belonged to the world, the part that had been shaped by forces beyond his control, the part that was still running, still hiding. The walls seemed to close in as they moved forward, the narrow passageway tightening around them like a vice. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of their footsteps was marking their progress, leaving behind a trail of questions that only Jack could answer. Amelia squeezed his hand tighter, her fingers trembling slightly. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew that the moment had arrived, the moment when everything would either fall apart or they would build something stronger from the wreckage of the past. Finally, Jack stopped, his body stiffening as he looked up at the wall in front of him. Amelia followed his gaze, her heart skipping a beat when she saw what he was staring at. A door. Old and weathered, its wood cracked with age, the handle twisted and worn from years of use. It wasn't just a door, it was a symbol of everything Jack had been hiding, the threshold he had never crossed, the place where his past had been buried, locked away behind layers of secrets and lies. Amelia could feel Jack's breath catch in his throat as he reached out for the door, his fingers brushing the cold handle. He hesitated for a moment, his body tense, before he turned to face her. There was fear in his eyes, but there was also something else, something more profound, regret, sorrow, and something even deeper, the longing for release, for the chance to be free. "I've never told anyone about this place," Jack said, his voice low and almost hoarse. "Not even myself. But if I'm going to move forward, I have to face it. I have to confront the truth, no matter how ugly it is." Amelia's heart swelled with understanding, but she couldn't help the fear that rose in her chest. What if the truth was more than either of them could bear? What if the secret was something that would tear them apart? But she couldn't let that fear control her. She couldn't let it hold them back. She stepped closer to him, her voice steady but soft. "You don't have to do this alone, Jack. I'm right here. Whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he turned back to the door. With a deep breath, he reached for the handle, his fingers curling around it with a finality that sent a chill through Amelia's spine. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness beyond, and as the door swung wide, Amelia's breath caught in her throat. What was waiting for them on the other side? The door creaked open slowly, as though reluctant to reveal the darkness beyond. Jack stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. The air in the alley seemed to grow colder, the fog swirling around their ankles like a living thing. Amelia hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on the dimly lit doorway that led into the unknown. She could feel her pulse quicken, her mind racing with the possibilities of what they might find. Jack turned back to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost tentative. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that made her heart ache. He had been carrying this secret for so long, and now, standing on the precipice, he wasn't sure what would happen next. Would he find peace, or would this moment unravel everything they had built? Amelia stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her heart filled with a quiet strength. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going anywhere. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with him. She had already made that promise to herself, and to him. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady, even though the uncertainty of what was to come gnawed at the edges of her resolve. "We're in this together, Jack." Jack nodded, his lips pressing into a tight line. With one final deep breath, he pushed the door open completely, stepping into the darkness beyond. The dim light from the street filtered in, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. It smelled musty, like old wood and dust, the remnants of something long forgotten. Amelia followed him, her senses heightened as the door swung shut behind them, sealing them in the dark. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of their footsteps on the floor, the soft thud of their hearts echoing in the emptiness. They stood at the threshold of a room that was old, abandoned, untouched by time, at least on the surface. The air was thick with the past, and as Amelia's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to make out the details. The cracked wooden beams above them, the worn, faded furniture scattered across the room, the dust covering every surface. It felt like a place lost in time, a place that Jack had tried to forget. But now, standing in it, she realized that he couldn't escape it, not entirely. She turned to Jack, who was already moving deeper into the room, his eyes scanning the walls, the corners, as if expecting something to leap out at him. He was tense, his jaw tight, but he kept moving forward as though drawn by some unseen force. "This is where it all started," Jack muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where they created me, where everything was set in motion, the place I've been running from." Amelia took a step closer to him, her hand reaching out instinctively. He didn't look at her, but he didn't pull away either. The air between them felt thick, heavy with the weight of their pasts, but Amelia didn't let the silence swallow them. She couldn't. "What happened here, Jack?" she asked gently, her voice breaking through the quiet. He took a deep breath, his shoulders tense. "They thought they could make me into something I wasn't. They thought they could control me, turn me into a weapon, but I fought. I fought for control, and I won, for a while. But now, I'm not sure I can outrun it anymore." Amelia's heart ached as she watched him, her fingers curling into her palm. She could see the pain in his eyes, the torment that still lingered from his past. But she also saw something else, determination. Jack had fought for his freedom once, and maybe, just maybe, he could fight again. "You don't have to fight alone anymore, Jack," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Jack finally turned to face her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself be seen, completely, fully. The walls he had built up around himself began to crumble, piece by piece, as he met her gaze. "I don't know what's waiting for us here," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I'm not running anymore. I'm ready to face it. With you." Amelia nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. They weren't done yet, but this was a beginning of something new, something that could finally push back the darkness of Jack's past and allow them both to step into the light. Amelia watched as Jack moved deeper into the room, his eyes darting across the walls as if searching for something, some kind of clue, some piece of his past that could make sense of everything. He moved with purpose now, no longer the guarded, distant figure he had once been. He was letting himself feel, letting himself face the things he had been running from for so long. And as he did, Amelia could feel the change within him, the shift from fear to resolve. "Do you remember what it felt like?" Amelia asked, her voice soft as she followed him. "When you first realized what they were doing to you?" Jack paused, his back to her, and for a long moment there was nothing but the sound of the faint breeze outside the window. Then he spoke, his voice distant, as though he were recalling a memory that felt both too close and too far away. "I don't know if I can even explain it. It felt like waking up inside a nightmare, like I was trapped in someone else's life. I didn't know who I was, what I was supposed to be. All I knew was that I wasn't what they wanted me to be, and I had to fight to hold on to that." Amelia's heart ached for him. She couldn't imagine the pain, the confusion he must have felt, but she knew one thing for certain. He wasn't that person anymore. He had grown. He had fought for something better, even if he hadn't fully realized it yet. "You fought so hard, Jack," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And you're not fighting alone anymore. You have me. You have us." Jack turned slowly to face her, his eyes filled with something new, a strength, a certainty, and a quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't need to say anything more. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Amelia could see the change in him, see the moment when he finally let go of the past, when he stopped running from who he truly was. And she knew that, whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The room around them felt different now, no longer a place of fear, but a place of release. The air was clearer, lighter, as if Jack's own soul had taken a deep breath, ready to step into a future that he could now control. He wasn't a weapon. He wasn't a product of someone else's making. He was his own person, with his own destiny, and he had the power to shape it. Jack reached out to her, his hand steady, his touch gentle. "Let's go," he said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. "Let's leave this place behind." Amelia smiled, her heart full as she took his hand, ready to step into the future with him, wherever it might lead. The night had settled around them like a cloak, soft and quiet, the air crisp with the promise of a new beginning. Amelia and Jack walked side by side through the narrow streets of the city, the last traces of the day's warmth slowly fading away. The fog had returned, though it was lighter now, curling like tendrils around the corners of buildings, wrapping itself around their footsteps. It felt as if they were stepping into a new world, one that was still unfamiliar but full of untapped potential. Amelia glanced over at Jack, noticing the subtle shift in his posture. He wasn't the same man who had stepped into that old, forgotten alleyway days ago. No longer burdened by the ghosts of his past, he walked with a newfound resolve, his steps steady, his gaze clear. His transformation wasn't instantaneous, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but Amelia could feel the change in him, just as she could feel the change in herself. There was a weightlessness to the air between them now, as though the barriers that had once existed, between them and within Jack, were beginning to dissolve. Their conversation had been minimal, but the silence they shared spoke volumes. It wasn't uncomfortable, but rather filled with an understanding that they no longer needed to fill every space with words. They were both learning, both growing, and somehow that shared experience bound them tighter than any spoken promise ever could. The city around them was still alive, but there was something quieter about it tonight, something gentler. Amelia could feel the pulse of it in her chest, the rhythm of the city matching her own heartbeat. It was a strange sense of belonging, something she hadn't anticipated when she first set foot here. She had come seeking answers, seeking to understand Jack, but somewhere along the way, she had found herself as well. She glanced up at the sky, now dotted with the first stars of the evening. It was a rare sight in the city, where the lights of the streets often drowned out the stars. But tonight, the clouds had parted just enough to reveal the vastness of the universe above them. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. There was so much they didn't know, so many questions left unanswered, but in that moment, she didn't feel afraid. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the quiet night. She didn't need to ask. She could see the change in him, feel it in the way he moved, the way he stood taller now. But still, she asked, because she wanted to hear it from him. Jack didn't immediately answer, his eyes still forward, but she could see the corner of his mouth twitch in what might have been the hint of a smile. "I feel like... I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I feel lighter. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm carrying everything with me." His words hung in the air between them, fragile yet profound. Amelia felt a rush of warmth in her chest. She had seen him struggle, seen the darkness that had threatened to consume him, but now, here he was, standing beside her, ready to face whatever came next. She had never realized how much he had been holding on to, how much he had been keeping from the world until now, but that weight was no longer his to carry alone. "We're not alone," she said quietly, her voice steady but full of meaning. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Jack's gaze shifted to hers, his eyes soft with something Amelia couldn't quite place. Gratitude, maybe, or just a quiet understanding. Whatever it was enough to make her heart swell. "I never thought I'd get here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now, I feel like I'm starting to believe I can." She squeezed his hand, the simple gesture speaking volumes. They were walking into the unknown, but for the first time, neither of them felt uncertain. Together, they could face anything. The streets grew quieter as they moved deeper into the city, the light from the lampposts casting long shadows on the cobblestone pathways. The fog had thickened again, curling around their feet, and the world around them seemed to shrink, closing in with a quiet sense of intimacy. It was as if the city itself had accepted their presence, had recognized that they, too, were part of its story now. Amelia felt Jack's presence beside her like an anchor, grounding her as they moved through the streets. She had never realized how much of herself she had lost, how much of her own identity had been shaped by the lives of others until she had met him. In a way, Jack had forced her to confront her own truths, to stop hiding behind the walls she had built. And now, as they walked side by side, she felt as though she were walking towards something new, something hers. "I used to be afraid of this place," Jack said, his voice breaking the silence. He sounded almost nostalgic, the words heavy with memories. "Afraid of everything here, of what I was, of what I could be. But now..." He trailed off, his eyes meeting hers. "It doesn't feel so bad." Amelia looked up at him, the softness in his gaze catching her off guard. She had never imagined that Jack would ever feel anything other than a burden in this city, that he would ever feel anything but the weight of his own creation hanging over him. But something had shifted. Something had changed, not just in him, but in the way they both viewed the world around them. "Maybe it's because you've stopped running," she said, her voice thoughtful. "You've let go of everything that's been holding you back, And now you're free to see the world for what it really is." He nodded slowly, his gaze distant as if he were seeing the city through a new lens, one that had been polished by the truth they had uncovered together. "Maybe, or maybe it's because for the first time I don't have to be afraid of what's ahead. I don't have to be afraid of myself." Amelia smiled, her heart swelling at the words. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak with such certainty, with such confidence in who he was becoming, and for the first time she realized that they both had the chance to rebuild, to redefine themselves in a world that had never truly understood them. "We can create our own path," she said quietly, her voice full of meaning. "We don't have to follow anyone else's." Jack turned to look at her, his eyes soft but filled with an intensity that took her breath away. "You're right. Together, we can do anything." The streetlights flickered as they continued walking, their shadows merging into one, the lines between them blurring. It felt as though the fog around them had parted, as though the future was no longer something to be feared, but something to be embraced. The city, once a place of darkness and uncertainty, had become a canvas for them, a place where they could write their own story. And as they walked together, hand in hand, the world ahead of them no longer seemed so daunting. They had each other, and that was enough. The quiet of the night was only interrupted by the soft crunch of their footsteps against the cobblestone streets. The air was cool, but not unpleasant, as if the city itself had exhaled a sigh of relief. Amelia and Jack continued walking, side by side, their conversation ebbing and flowing like the tides of a distant sea. The world around them felt as if it were expanding, each step they took leading them further into the unknown, but also closer to the possibility of something new, something that belonged only to them. They had reached a small park, one that Amelia had never noticed before, its boundaries softened by the fog that still clung to the trees. The park was quiet, its pathways winding through the tall, shadowed trees, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the grass. It felt like a haven, a place untouched by time, a place where they could leave behind the weight of their past and step into the future. Amelia slowed her pace, taking in the beauty of the place. The rustling of the leaves in the trees was the only sound now, the gentle whispers of nature. She breathed in deeply, the scent of wet earth and pine filling her lungs. It was peaceful here, a world away from the chaos and confusion they had left behind. Jack stopped beside her, his gaze drifting over the landscape. "I never really thought about places like this," he said, his voice low, contemplative. "Always too busy thinking about what I was supposed to be, what I was running from. I never stopped to appreciate the things that are here, right in front of me." Amelia turned to look at him, her heart swelling with a quiet affection. "That's because you were never free to see them," she said softly. "You were too caught up in everything they told you to be, but now, Jack, you're free. You're finally free to be whoever you want to be." Jack turned to face her fully, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I don't know who I am yet," he said, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I've spent so long being someone else that I don't know what it means to be me. But when I'm with you, I feel like I'm starting to find that person." Amelia reached out, her fingers brushing against his, sending a spark of warmth through her veins. "You don't have to have it all figured out," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We'll figure it out together, one step at a time." Jack nodded, his lips curving into a faint, uncertain smile. "I think I'm finally ready to take that first step, to stop looking back and start moving forward." They stood there for a long moment, their hands still intertwined, as the city around them faded into the background. Amelia felt something shift inside her, a quiet resolve taking root. She had never imagined this moment, this feeling of peace, of connection, of being on the same path as someone else. But here it was, unfolding before her. Together they had come this far. Together they would face whatever came next. The park seemed to stretch on forever, its trees swaying gently in the breeze, their branches intertwining like the threads of a tapestry. Amelia and Jack continued walking, the fog wrapping around them like a cocoon, soft and enveloping. The further they walked, the more the weight of their pasts seemed to fall away, leaving only the present, only this moment. The world felt lighter here, more alive, as if the city itself were holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The path they followed curved around a small pond, its surface smooth like glass, reflecting the pale light of the street lamps above. Amelia couldn't remember the last time she had felt so at peace, so unburdened. Her heart was lighter, the uncertainty of the future no longer something to fear but something to embrace. She glanced at Jack, and for the first time, she saw him without the shadow of his past hanging over him. He was here, in this moment, with her. "This place is—" she started, her voice trailing off as she took in the beauty around them. "It's like a dream." Jack turned to her, his gaze soft. "Yeah," he agreed quietly. "It feels like we've stepped out of everything else, like we've created our own little world here." Amelia smiled, her fingers still gently entwined with his. "I like that," she said. "Maybe we can make this our world, a place where we're not defined by what we were or what others expect us to be, just us." Jack squeezed her hand, his smile becoming more confident, more real. "I think that sounds perfect." They stopped at the edge of the pond, staring out across the water. The surface rippled slightly with the breeze, the reflection of the trees and the sky distorted in the moving water. Amelia took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. She could hear the distant hum of the city, but it felt far away, like a different world. Here, in this moment, nothing else mattered, nothing but them. Jack turned toward her, his expression serious now, but there was warmth in his eyes. "Amelia," he said softly, his voice almost hesitant. "I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what we're going to face, but I do know that I'm not running anymore, not from myself, not from you. I'm ready to face whatever comes next, as long as it's with you." Her heart skipped a beat at his words, and she felt a surge of emotion rise in her chest. "You don't have to face it alone," she whispered, her voice thick with feeling. "I'm right here. I'll always be here." Jack nodded, his hand reaching up to gently cup her cheek. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with more gratitude than she had ever heard from him before. "For everything, for being here with me, for giving me the chance to be me." Amelia leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment. She didn't know what the future held, but she didn't need to. As long as they had each other, she knew they could face anything. The world around them felt as if it had stopped moving, the night wrapped in silence, save for the soft rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of the city. In this quiet moment, Amelia felt as if time itself had taken a pause, allowing them to breathe, to exist, without the weight of the world pressing down on them. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, their hands still entwined, their hearts beating in sync. The future was uncertain, but it no longer felt daunting. It felt full of possibility. They had made it this far together, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The sky was still dark when they arrived at the edge of the city, the soft glow of dawn just beginning to push against the horizon, casting a pale light over the world. The fog, which had once felt so suffocating, was now retreating, slowly lifting from the streets, the air growing lighter with each passing second. The night, with all its uncertainties, was finally giving way to the first rays of a new day, and with it, Jack and Amelia stood on the threshold of something far greater than they had ever imagined. The morning breeze was cool against their skin as they walked side by side, their steps in sync with one another. They had come to the edge of the city, far from the noise and the confusion, to a quiet place where the world felt open and full of possibility. The streets were empty at this hour, the buildings around them quiet and still, as though holding their breath, waiting for the sun to rise and the city to wake. Amelia looked up at Jack, feeling the warmth of the moment, the quiet certainty that had settled in her heart. He had changed, and so had she. They had both shed the weight of their pasts, faced the shadows that had once defined them, and come through it all stronger than they had ever imagined. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. A new chapter, a new dawn, and they were walking toward it, together. "I never thought I'd feel like this," Jack said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was filled with a quiet awe, as though he were seeing the world for the first time. "I always thought I was trapped, like there was no way out. But now, it feels like the world is open to me, like anything is possible." Amelia smiled, her hand brushing against his. She felt the same way. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an adventure. And with Jack by her side, it felt like anything was possible. "It's a new beginning for both of us," she said softly. "We're not running from anything anymore. We're building something new." Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "I don't know what's out there, but I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready to face whatever comes next. With you." They continued walking, the sun slowly rising behind them, casting long shadows on the pavement. The world was waking up, and so were they. They had found each other in the midst of their struggles, and now, standing together in the quiet of the morning, they had found peace. The city around them seemed to pulse with possibility, its streets waiting to be explored, its corners waiting to be uncovered. And with each step they took, they were carving their own path, leaving behind the shadows of their pasts, walking toward a future that was theirs to create. The air felt fresh, clean, like a new day had begun, not just for the city, but for them as well. Everything felt different now, brighter, clearer. The fog had lifted, both in the world and in their hearts. The world was full of stories waiting to be written, and Jack and Amelia had just begun to write their own. As the sun rose higher, casting its golden light over the streets, the city began to stir. The soft murmur of life started to seep into the quiet of the morning, the distant hum of the first buses, the rustle of newspapers, the chatter of people as they began their daily routines. But for Amelia and Jack, the world felt still, untouched by the hurry and noise that surrounded them. They were in a space of their own, walking together as if the rest of the world had faded into the background. They reached the outskirts of the city, where the buildings thinned out, and the open fields stretched before them, bathed in the soft glow of the early morning light. The city felt like a distant memory now, its complexities and struggles left behind. The only thing that mattered was the path they were walking together, the future they were about to create. Jack stopped for a moment, turning to Amelia. "I don't know what to expect, but I know that I don't have to do it alone. Not anymore. And that means everything to me." Amelia's heart swelled as she looked at him, her hand reaching for his. The connection between them was stronger now, a bond that had been forged in the quiet moments, in the shared struggles, and in the trust they had built. "We're not alone," she said softly, her voice full of certainty. "Not anymore. We have each other." Jack smiled, his eyes filled with a quiet happiness. "I never thought I'd find someone like you, someone who would understand, who would stay with me no matter what. You've shown me what it means to be free. And now, I feel like I can be myself, completely, without fear." Amelia stepped closer to him, her heart beating in time with his. The world was still full of unknowns, but she knew that they could face anything as long as they were together. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Jack. You've already started to change. We both have." The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning. They had come so far, together. But they both knew that this was just the beginning of something new. The city, the world, their lives, everything was waiting for them, and they were ready to take it all on. Jack turned, his hand still holding hers, and together they walked into the open field, the vastness of the world stretching before them. The morning light danced on the grass, and the world seemed to come alive with the promise of a new day. Amelia felt the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had survived, but she also felt the exhilaration of what lay ahead. The future was uncertain, but it no longer felt like something to be feared. It felt like something to be embraced. They walked forward, side by side, leaving the past behind them and stepping into a new chapter, one that was theirs to write. The sun was now fully risen, bathing the world in its warm, golden light. The field stretched out before them, endless and untouched, a world full of promise. Amelia and Jack walked on, their pace slow but steady, as if savoring the feeling of freedom that had eluded them for so long. They had reached the edge of the city, but in a way it felt like they were stepping into a completely new world, one that they could shape together, one that was free of the weight of secrets and fears that had once defined them. They walked for what felt like hours, lost in the quiet hum of the world around them. The grass beneath their feet swayed gently in the wind, and the distant trees seemed to stretch toward the sky, reaching for something beyond the horizon. Amelia could feel the peace settling in her chest, like a deep, contented sigh. It wasn't just the landscape that had changed, it was everything. They had both changed. As they reached the crest of a hill, they stopped to look out at the vast expanse of the world before them. The city was a distant memory now, its silhouette fading into the distance. The world stretched out before them, empty and waiting, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt full of potential. They had the power to decide what came next, and for the first time, the future felt like a blank canvas, ready to be painted with the colors of their dreams. Jack turned to Amelia, his face illuminated by the soft light of the morning. "I used to think the world was a place that could break me," he said quietly, his voice filled with the weight of everything he had been through. "But now I see it differently. It's not the world that breaks us, it's the choices we make, and I've made mine." Amelia smiled, feeling the sincerity in his words. She had watched him grow, watched him come to terms with the man he had been and the person he was becoming. And now, standing beside him on the edge of the world, she knew that they were ready to face whatever came next. "We've both made our choices," she said softly, her voice steady but full of emotion. "And we're not going back. This is our future now, together." Jack reached for her hand, his fingers entwining with hers in a gesture that was simple but filled with meaning. It was a promise, a vow that they would face everything that came their way, side by side. They stood there for a long moment, just taking in the view, the silence between them a comfortable one. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for them to make the next move. But they didn't need to rush. They had time now. They had time to figure it all out, to explore this new life they had built together. "I'm not afraid anymore," Jack said quietly, his voice full of quiet strength. "I used to be afraid of the things I couldn't control, but now I know that the only thing I need to control is myself. And with you by my side, I think I can handle anything." Amelia felt a swell of emotion in her chest at his words. She had never imagined that she would find herself here, standing on the edge of everything she had ever wanted, and yet here she was, with Jack, ready to face the world, together. "I'm not afraid either," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. "I used to be, But now I know that as long as we're together, we can make it through anything." They shared a quiet smile, their eyes locked in understanding. The world was full of uncertainty, but they didn't need to know everything. They didn't need to have all the answers. All they needed was each other and the belief that together they could face whatever came their way. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its light over the world, they began to walk again, side by side, toward a future that was theirs to shape, theirs to claim. The past was behind them now, and ahead lay the promise of a new beginning. The world stretched out before them, open and full of possibility. And with each step they took, they knew they were one step closer to the life they had always dreamed of. The days that followed felt like a dream, a slow, unfolding story of new beginnings and uncharted territory. Jack and Amelia found themselves in places they had never imagined, both physically and emotionally. They traveled through the countryside, exploring small towns, finding hidden corners of the world that spoke to their souls in ways they had never expected. They learned to live without fear, without the burden of secrets that had once held them back. The shadows of their pasts still lingered, but they no longer defined who they were. Every day they built something new, something of their own making, and every day they found more of themselves in the process. As the seasons changed, so did their relationship. It grew deeper, richer, full of understanding and respect. They learned the rhythms of each other's hearts, the quiet moments that spoke louder than words ever could. They celebrated the small victories and weathered the storms together, always side by side, always united by the bond they had forged. Years passed, but their journey never really ended. It transformed, evolved, always moving forward. They found peace in knowing that the road was long, but it was their road. Together they would walk it, step by step, facing whatever the future held with the quiet confidence that came from knowing they could overcome anything. And so their story continued, a story of redemption, of love, of second chances, a story that began with two people broken by their pasts and ended with two souls who had found each other in the most unexpected of places, ready to take on the world together. As they walked hand in hand into the sunset, the world around them was full of light, and the future stretched before them like an endless horizon. They had found their way home,